Previously on Sweet Loot Photography. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the video. This is part 2 of 3. Part 3 should be coming out next week unless I'm a fuck up. Part 3 will pit the 5D Mark III versus the 6D Mark II. And this is not a sponsored video. Gear review! Ow, fuck! In this corner, weighing in at 26.2 megapixels, flexing its fully articulating screen, it's the 6D Mark II, and the returning champion, the oldie but the goodie, weighing in at a whopping 23.2 megapixels, the 5D Mark III. Yeah, that's a wrestling joke. The 5D Mark III is still up at $2,300 brand new on Amazon, while the 6D Mark II recently saw a price dip and is a full $1,000 cheaper. Coming in at $1,300 brand new on Amazon, there is officially a large price gap now. When I first bought my 6D Mark II, the prices were much closer together, hence the comparison, unfortunately for me. But if we go to the used market, the 5D Mark III fluctuates between $1,000 and $1,300, and the 6D Mark II is right around the same price. Interesting. The comparison's still on. Neither of these cameras are new, but this conversation was a huge deal for me last year when I bought my 6D Mark II. And just because they're not new cameras doesn't mean they aren't relevant. If you find yourself in the same boat as me, hey, maybe this video can help you out a little bit. Welcome to part 3 of my Canon trilogy. This review is going to be divided into 2 main parts, the feel of operating these 2 cameras, and then a quick rundown of head-to-head comparisons and specs. If you want deep dives on the 2 cameras, you can watch parts 1 and 2 of this series. In those videos, I broke down the 5D Mark III and the 6D Mark II in great detail. But for now, let's just jump into it. Let's talk about our feelings. Pass me the talking pillow, Skylar. I need to say my part.
I have the talking pillow.
And since we're sharing and being open, I guess it would be a good time to warn you that this is kind of a hot take. When the 6D Mark II first came out, it was trashed online. So many people basically said the camera was garbage.
And the reason is that as a reviewer, there's just nothing interesting about this camera at all. It has 0 new features. It's just an 80D with a slightly bigger sensor. It's just words like, what do you talk about? There's no headline with this camera.
But then a weird phenomenon happened. People started saying that they were wrong.
I was wrong about the Canon 6D Mark II. When I reviewed it, I said it was a good all-around camera, but that it was boring because it didn't do anything the best.
You had people coming straight out and saying, yeah, I didn't really even have an intention to try this camera.
Full disclosure, I never planned to review this, to even use it, to touch it, to even take a single photo with it.
And to be honest, when I first heard about the 6D Mark II, I was so underwhelmed. It felt like the biggest failure of a camera for 2017.
I can feel you hovering on that dislike button, and I do need to say, no disrespect to these creators, I follow all of them, and I do like their videos a lot. But I'm gonna make a point here, stick with me. Now don't get me wrong here, you can have a change of heart for sure. And maybe it is just because if you want a flip out screen with dual pixel autofocus and a full frame camera from Canon, I mean this is kind of it. There aren't many choices. But I digress. Many YouTubers adopted this camera, warts and all. Some of them still use the camera to this day, like me. Others have moved on to the Sony mirrorless systems. I've seen more and more people using Fuji as well, like Danae and Andrew. Mwah, mwah, go sub them if you're into that Fuji life. What am I getting at here? Well, it's time for some seriously brutal honesty. Now, I pride myself on the fact that I'm very transparent on this channel. I try to give you really clear views and cut away the bullshit. I mean, there's always time for memes, but I try to bring you value with my experience. And that's why it's a little bit embarrassing for me to admit that part of the reason I went for the 6D Mark II was because of how many big YouTubers were using it. Peter McKinnon, Matty Hapoya, Chris Howe, Casey Neistat. It worked for them, so it must be good, right? It's a valuable lesson for me, and I hope you take it away as well. YouTube reviews, they're good. They can be very informative. They can really help you come to a decision, but they should never be your decision. I spent so much time thinking about the opinions of these other filmmakers at the time I purchased the 6D Mark II. I forgot to think about the most important filmmaker in my life, me. And I know it's a little weird of me to say this literally inside a YouTube review video, but it's important. My hope is that the videos I make help inform you, but please, test cameras for yourselves. A lot of this shit is really subjective. The problems I have with the 6D Mark II might not be problems at all for you. But anyway, let's get back on track with my personal experience with the cameras. The 5D Mark III and the 6D Mark II are both really important and significant cameras to me. The 5D Mark III was the camera that I made a ton of my older films with over on Nailed It. I'm super proud of those films, and it was an essential tool that helped make our zero-budget indie films possible. The 6D Mark II, on the other hand, helped build this channel. It's part of the reason why you guys are here today. It was the daily driver that helped make the videos happen, regardless of its issues that I talked about in the other video. Alright, I'm sorry. I am done using that joke. But if I had to sum things up for me, the 5D Mark III is what Canon was, and the 6D Mark II is what Canon is now. And that's a little bit of a bummer. Where the 5D Mark II and III were innovative cameras pushing the boundaries of what DSLRs could do, the 6D Mark II is more in tune with Canon's current MO. Play it safe. Use the brand name to sell the camera. Now, the 6D Mark II is just part of an underwhelming trend in Canon's releases. Even looking to now, like 2019, the EOS R and RP they're just kind of bland to me. They don't push the envelope at all. In my opinion, and this really isn't all that hard to believe, but Canon is forcing users to pick and choose what options matter, like frame rates, or dual pixel autofocus, or 4K without a crop. There isn't one camera that does it all. And I understand that is definitely business, that's how it works, but it's hard to feel like they're not arbitrarily doing it to sell the better cameras.
Canon EOS 90D and EOS M6 Mark II user manuals released. Confirms no 24 FPS video.
And then on the other hand, you have Sony stacking features from the A9, which is one of their top-of-the-line cameras, into entry-level APS-C cameras. Maybe that's why they're doing so well. They're making their technology more accessible to everyone. Maybe there's a ceiling to the innovation. Maybe DSLRs are truly reaching their limits and mirrorless cameras are the future. But that's a lot of speculation. I don't think I'm qualified to make a call like that. But what I am qualified to talk about is my real-world operations. So these are my findings. If I know that I'm doing something that's only photography, maybe it's a wedding, maybe it's a portrait shoot, I'm going for the 5D Mark III. I find that the 5D Mark III works better in a pure photography scenario. Its autofocus is more reliable, hands down. While the images, to me, they're quite similar in terms of ISO performance, in terms of color science and all that jazz, the autofocus to me, in my experience, is significantly more reliable on the 5D Mark III. If I'm doing something that's purely video focused, maybe I'm doing wedding video, maybe I'm working on a YouTube video, I would go for the 6D Mark II. The IPB compression along with the video bitrate is an issue, and I will say for showing it on a huge screen, yeah, you're probably going to notice it, but for these YouTube uploads, the amount of compression that goes into it, it's probably negligible. So if that's your usage for it, hey, you know, probably not that big of a deal. The dual pixel autofocus and the articulating screen just make video easier. Having a built-in time-lapse mode is a really nice feature too. I use that way more often than I thought I was going to. If I'm in a hybrid scenario, I'm shooting both photo and video, I think I would still go with the 6D, even though it has its drawbacks. I think the flip-out screen, the touch to focus, all that stuff, even just the fact that it has a brighter screen and it's easier to see in the sunlight, it just makes it the more practical choice. That said, when I'm shooting the photos, I would have to deal with those focusing drawbacks. Like I said, I think the 5D Mark III's focusing system is just way more user-friendly and way more reliable. For astrophotography, since I'm full manual and on a tripod, I really don't see a huge difference between the two cameras. Granted, if you are into doing time lapses of the night sky, the 6D Mark II might be better since there is a built-in time-lapse mode that records in 4K. On a more broad level, I much prefer the feel of the 5D Mark III. It's bulkier, it's heavier, it's extra thick. It feels more sturdy and more robust. The 6D Mark II, while it's not that much smaller, it doesn't feel as grippy, if that makes any sense. So to tie a bow on this section, I think it's important to understand the idea of having a camera that works with you. To me, a camera is a tool that's helping you execute your vision. That's why I try not to get caught up in brand loyalty or anything like that. Whatever works for me, that's cool. When I'm using the 5D and the 6D, I feel as though the 5D works with me, whereas I have to work with the 6D Mark II. There are a bunch of little issues with the 6D Mark II that have just added up over time and have gotten to the point now where it's just kind of annoying to operate. And that's why even though the 5D Mark III is much older, I still have a lot more fun shooting on that camera. Okay, so I told you how I feel, but the talking pillow remains with me. My video, deal with it.
Alright, I've got the talking pillow now.
Honestly, there isn't a tremendous difference in the photo quality between these two cameras, especially if you take your shots into Lightroom and edit them. But here's a quick collection of photos. You're gonna have 3 seconds to guess which camera it was before I reveal the answer. So now that I've thoroughly discussed my feelings, we're gonna do a quick head-to-head rundown of specs. Hopefully this can act as a bullet point list to help with your decision. First off, we're gonna talk about ISO. ISO seems pretty similar to me, honestly. The 6D Mark II might be a little bit better, but I don't really see that big of a difference between the two. In terms of video, I think the ISO performance is slightly better on the 6D Mark II, but again, I don't see that huge of a difference. The 5D Mark III has a native ISO of 100 to 25,600. The 6D Mark II has a native ISO of 100 to 40,000, and both are expandable to 102,400, which is just completely unusable, and it's just a marketing thing. You're never gonna use that ISO. It's terrible. As previously mentioned in the wrestling joke at the beginning, the 5D Mark III has a 22.3 megapixel sensor, the 6D Mark II has a 26.2 megapixel sensor. It's a pretty small difference, honestly. I've never found myself in a scenario where I went back to the 5D Mark III and I said, ooh man, I'm really missing those 3-4 megapixels from the 6D Mark II. And while we're on the topic of megapixels, both cameras have full frame CMOS sensors. The maximum shutter speed on the 5D Mark III is 1/8,000th of a second, while the maximum shutter speed on the 6D Mark II is dropped down to 1/4000th of a second. The 5D Mark III has the appropriately named Digic 5 Plus processor, while the 6D Mark II has the upgraded, slightly newer Digic 7 processor. Also, can we just talk about this 5D Mark III promo for a second? Like, this was 2013. This video feels like it's 100 years old. What the fuck? The 5D Mark III has a burst rate of 6 frames per second, while the 6D Mark II has a burst rate of 6.5 frames a second. Wow. One important thing to talk about though is the buffer, so let's test these out head to head really quick, because the processor might make a difference between how fast the buffers fill up. It makes a difference. In terms of autofocus, the 5D Mark III has 61 autofocus points, 41 of which are cross-type, and the 6D Mark II has 45 autofocus points, all of which are cross-type. The 5D Mark III has more autofocus coverage throughout the frame. The autofocus points are spread out further, whereas the 6D Mark II not only has less autofocus points, but they're kinda squished in the middle. The 5D Mark III also has the magical joystick that I love and talk about so much. The 6D Mark II doesn't. It instead has the directional pad. The 6D Mark II has dual pixel autofocus, so the video autofocus is really nice. When it wants to work, that is. Alright, so the question... let's, I guess we gotta get this off the bottom. Okay, so the thought is... we have to find out... Pokemon Go, you gotta move, I'm sorry. We have to find out if flex tape will become rigid when it sticks to itself. Stupid fucking thing. Oh, great. Yeah, 60, don't even worry about it. You don't have to focus. The 5D Mark III doesn't have any such dual pixel autofocus. There's no video autofocus at all in the 5D Mark III. So if you're really down with that manual focus video life, you get that all-eye compression. But if you need that video autofocus, well, you're stuck with the 6D Mark II. Speaking of video, the 5D Mark III is capped out at 30 frames per second. The 6D Mark II can do 60 frames a second. The 5D Mark III has the all-eye and IPB compressions, while the 6D Mark II only has the IPB, which, if you forgot from the previous video, in a nutshell is just smaller files with smaller bit rates. Neither cameras do 4K, though the 6D Mark II can do 4K in its time-lapse mode. There is no time-lapse mode in the 5D Mark III. The 5D Mark III has 2 card slots, one CF, one SD, while the 6D Mark II only has one SD card slot. You can program 3 custom setups on the 5D Mark III's wheel, while you can only program 2 on the 6D Mark II. Not the end of the world to me, but some people might care. The 6D Mark II has a better screen than the 5D in my opinion. It's just newer and I think it's brighter. The 6D Mark II's screen just performs better in the bright sunlight and it's fully articulating, which is a huge plus. The 5D Mark III obviously is just mounted onto the camera. One quality of life improvement that Canon made on the 6D Mark II that wasn't present in the 5D Mark III is the fact that when you switch between photo and video modes on the camera, it actually saves your settings. So right now I'm on 1/2000th of a second f1.4, ISO 400, and when I switch over to my video mode, you can see that it immediately switches back to 1/125th of a second f1.4 auto ISO. So it is a nice little thing that's going to save you some time in the long run. This feature is not present on the 5D Mark III. The 6D Mark II has Wi-Fi, NFC, GPS geotagging, and Bluetooth. You can pair the 6D Mark II with Canon's app and control the camera remotely. The 5D Mark III has none of those features. The 5D Mark III weighs 1.89 pounds, while the smaller 6D Mark II is only 1.51 pounds. Not a tremendous difference, especially when you slap a heavy lens onto it. The battery life is pretty great on both cameras. They both use the Canon LPE6 battery, which is easy enough to come by, and there's plenty of off-brands if you don't want to pay the full price. If you're shooting just stills, they'll last you a day. If you're doing video though, you're gonna chew through them pretty quickly. And that concludes the quick head-to-head tech spec crap. I hope you enjoyed it. Oh, wait a second. One last detail. The 5D Mark III has a headphone input. The 6D Mark II does not. While I initially bought the 6D Mark II for my YouTube stuff, over time I thought it could become my main hybrid shooter, the camera that I go to for both photo and video. And unfortunately, that never really became the case. I thought I'd sell the 5D Mark III as soon as I bought the 6D Mark II. Then it was, oh, I'll sell the 5D Mark III after I review both of the cameras. Now that I've spent the time with these reviews, I don't really know what I'm gonna do. Well, actually, I recently got a Sony A7 Mark III on loaner, and I think I know what I'm gonna do with these two Canons. Ultimately, the 5D Mark III and the 6D Mark II are both formidable cameras in 2019, as long as 4K isn't a deal breaker for you, that is. Overall, to me, if you're looking for a reliable full-frame DSLR for photography work, like weddings, portraits, anything like that, the 5D Mark III is a champion. If you need a solid full-frame B camera for video work, one that has a flip-out screen and dual-pixel autofocus, the 6D Mark II is a good choice. Though I do have to remind you again that Canon really hasn't given us a ton of cameras in that department. But the ball is in your court. By 2019 standards, there are better cameras in that price range. But if you're in the Canon ecosystem, these cameras still have some life in them. Which camera is better? It really depends on what your needs are. If you were forcing me to pick one, gun to the head, whatever the reason, I'd go with the 5D Mark III. It's just a more robust camera, and it has a better autofocusing system. Despite its lack of modern video features, it can still capture gorgeous footage. It's also just a thicker camera and it feels better in the hands. But that's just my opinion. Have you used both? Do you own both? Do you plan on getting one? Let me know what you're thinking in the comments below. And thank you so much for sticking around and watching part 3 of the Canon Trilogy. I hope this series has helped you decide on one of the two cameras, or at least I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts on using these cameras for such a long time. I really do have a lot of love for both of the cameras, even with their flaws. And as always guys, thank you for supporting the channel. Make sure you subscribe and like and share. And I'm on MySpace, I'm on Discord, I'm on Instagram, Horseman's on Instagram, YouTuber outro bullshit. I love you. See you in the next video. Goodbye. Go over to photo. The films, it's turned into this is the Milky Way or whatever night's photography time lapses. The 6D mic. So if you can fully adopt that manual fucking shit to guess which camera shot which shot it, blah blah blah.
Like and subscribe to Sweet Lou Photography. The man.